She laughed at my uniform, not knowing it was stitched with the weight of 200 million in gold. Thanksgiving, November 22nd, 2018, Houston, Texas. The evening air was cool, carrying the faint smell of pecan pies cooling on windowsills and the smoky trace of mesquite logs burning in backyard pits. I parked my old black Chevy 2 blocks from my son's house, adjusted my cap, and tugged at the sleeve of my uniform, navy blue crisp with a badge most people overlooked. It wasn't Armani. It wasn't Brooks Brothers, but it was mine. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're listening from. When I stepped through the front door, warmth hit me. Roasted turkey, buttered rolls, and cranberry sauce simmering on the stove. Megan, my daughter-in-law, met me in the foyer. She gave me a slow, assessing look, then smirked. "Wow," she said, her voice carrying into the dining room. Patrick came dressed for Comic-Con. Cheap polyester cosplay. The room erupted with chuckles. Forks clinked against china. My son's laugh was softer, stifled, but it was there. He wouldn't look at me. His eyes darted to his plate, his fork stalling mid-air. I clenched the chain under my shirt, the one that carried my late wife's wedding ring. Its cool metal pressed steady against my chest, anchoring me while the laughter buzzed around the table. I didn't say a word. Silence, I've learned, carries a weight insults can't touch. I set my coat on the back of the chair and took my seat. Candlelight flickered over the turkey, golden brown and steaming. But every bite I swallowed tasted bitter. Megan leaned across the table, pretending to whisper but making sure her words traveled. "Do they even pay you for standing around like a mall cop?" Her voice had that syrupy sweetness, the kind people use when they want to sound innocent while twisting the knife. I wanted to tell her the truth, that hours earlier I'd overseen forklifts loading pallet after pallet of gold bars, each stamped, sealed, and locked in cages heavier than the walls of her immaculate home. That the badge on my chest opened vaults most people would never glimpse, that the uniform she mocked was stitched with contracts worth more than her wildest dreams. Instead, I lifted my coffee cup, my hand steady even though my heart wasn't. The conversation carried on. Football games, shopping sales, holiday plans, but I barely heard any of it. My sister, seated beside me, caught my eye more than once. Her jaw tightened, her gaze cold as steel whenever Megan spoke. She knew my silence wasn't weakness. It was restraint. Then came dessert. Pumpkin pie, pecan pie, whipped cream piled high, and with it Megan's final jab. She raised her glass of wine, her smile practiced. To promotions and real careers, she toasted, voice lilting with mock sincerity. Maybe next year Patrick will retire from cosplay. The glasses clinked. Laughter burst again. Even the crystal seemed to ring with cruelty. I excused myself early. My sister shifted as if to follow, but I shook my head. Outside, the night air was sharp, starlight pale against the black sky. I breathed deep, steadying myself, then slid into my truck. The dashboard lights glowed, and there it was, the slip of paper tucked safely in the console. $699,842. Advance deposit for the federal contract. I traced the numbers with my finger, the ink already smudged from my touch. That slip wasn't just money. It was 30 years of sacrifice. My wife's unfulfilled retirement dream, the foundation for my son's future. It was dignity, written in digits. Megan saw polyester. But this paper? It was gold. I pulled onto the empty freeway, the depot's floodlights rising in the distance. As I drove closer, the world changed. Security gates loomed, guards saluted, cameras tracked every angle, forklifts roared, carrying pallets that gleamed even under steel coverings. Inside, the bars stood stacked in their cages, silent and eternal. I ran my hand over one, its surface rough with stamped seals, 27 pounds each. Dignity pressed in metal. Yet her laughter still echoed louder than the clang of steel doors. My shift ended at 3 a.m. I drove back past their house, the windows dark, the driveway quiet. I idled at the curb, pocket watch in hand. My father's gift, each tick steady and patient. Through the windshield, I stared at the silent house. My son's shadow had once filled those rooms with laughter. Now his wife's sneer had carved distance where closeness used to be. I whispered to the night, to my wife Sip's memory. To myself, they one Sip shame us, not for polyester, not for pride. I tucked the $699,842 slip into the glove box, adjusted my cap, and drove into the dark. I didn't yet know how far her greed would reach, or how much evidence I'd have to gather before justice finally had its day. But I knew this. Every laugh tonight had planted a seed, and one day soon it would bloom in court. I knew humiliation was one thing, but betrayal at your own doorstep hits harder than any insult at a dinner table. The Sunday after Thanksgiving, November 25th, 2018, I drove back to my house in West Houston. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the oak trees that lined my street. I had 2 paper bags of groceries balanced in one arm, coffee, bread, and a bottle of cough syrup my sister swore I'd need in the winter. I slid the key into the lock. It didn't set turn. At first I thought I'd grabbed the wrong key off my ring. I tried again. Nothing. The deadbolt was new, shiny brass where my old steel lock used to be. I jiggled, twisted, pressed my shoulder into the doorframe. Nothing budged. Confused, I knocked. My son opened the door, his expression stiff, a nervous line etched between his brows. "Dad," he said, keeping his voice low. "We changed the locks." The bags in my arm grew heavy. "What do you mean we?" His eyes flicked behind him, toward the kitchen. "Megan thought it set'll be safer. You know, new neighborhood, strangers, all that." I looked past him into the hallway. I saw her leaning against the counter with a mug of tea, watching like a cat that had already eaten the bird. Her smile was thin, polite, but her eyes gleamed. "For safety," he repeated, like he was reading from her script. My grip tightened on the paper bags until the carton of eggs inside cracked. My father's pocket watch was warm in my palm, its tick steady against the chaos boiling in my chest. "That Sep's my house," I said evenly. "My name's Sep's on the deed." "I know," my son whispered, lowering his eyes. "But Megan just wants us to transition. She says with retirement coming, it's Sep's time for new arrangements." Retirement. The word dropped like lead. That meant she'd been talking about my contracts, my payout. My $699,842 advance wasn't public knowledge, but Megan had always been too curious about numbers, too eager with her questions. I left without another word. That night I sat in my truck outside the depot, watching forklifts disappear into the dark. My thermos of coffee sat cold in the cup holder. I couldn't go inside my own home, couldn't sleep in my own bed because of a woman who thought polyester meant poverty. Around midnight, when my shift was over, I stopped back by the house. Lights glowed upstairs. Through the frosted kitchen window, I saw her silhouette, phone pressed to her ear. I cracked my window and listened. Her voice carried, sharp and certain. "The old man Sip's just a guard," she said, her laughter dripping venom. "We sit'll trade him out before the payout. I sit him not waiting 30 years for scraps." I froze. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight I thought it would snap. She wasn't just mocking me anymore. She was planning. The words "before the payout" sliced deeper than any insult. She'd learned about the retirement bonus, not the exact figure, maybe, but enough to know it existed. And in her eyes, it wasn't mine. It was hers. I sat there until the lights went out, every second ticking louder than my watch. Betrayal has a sound. It's the click of a deadbolt locking you out of your own house, the muffled laugh through a thin pane of glass, the silence of your son too weak to say no. When I finally drove off, the night blurred around me. I pulled the pocket watch from my coat and held it against the wheel. My father's legacy. My anchor. I whispered into the empty cab, "You want war, Megan, then you shall have it. On paper, on record, and in court." But the hardest part wasn't her schemes. It was the shadow of my son standing in the doorway, torn between blood and vows. His silence cut deeper than her words. That night I made my first quiet promise of revenge. No shouting, no fists, no reckless anger. Just evidence. Cold, undeniable proof. Because I knew this much. The locks might have been changed, but the truth was still mine to hold. There's a moment in every betrayal where silence turns into strategy. For me, it began on December 1st, 2018, a Saturday, cold rain falling steady over Houston. I drove to my sister's house on the east side, my old Chevy humming over wet pavement. On the passenger seat sat a plain cardboard box. Inside, a stack of shipping manifests, stamped with federal seals and signatures. Each page was more than paper. It was leverage contracts tied to the December 22nd gold run. When I pulled into her driveway, my sister Marianne was already waiting at the door. She wore her gray sweater, the one she always pulled tight when she was worried. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said as I stepped inside. "Not a ghost," I told her, setting the box on her table. "Something worse, greed in the flesh." We sat in her living room, the ticking of her wall clock filling the silence. I pulled out the manifests, laying them carefully on the table like relics. "These," I said, "are worth more than gold. If Megan ever got her hands on them," she said, "run straight to her lawyer and tear this family apart." Marianne frowned, smoothing a page with her hand. The ink shimmered under the lamp. "Then why bring them here?" "Because my locks don't work anymore," I said quietly. Her mouth tightened, anger flashing in her eyes. She'd always been my protector, even when we were kids. Without a word, she stood, disappeared into her study, and returned with an old leather-bound Bible. The cover was worn, its spine cracked from decades of sermons and Sundays. She opened it, and inside the pages had been hollowed out into a secret compartment. "Dad used to keep emergency cash in here," she said, voice low. "Guess it Sem's time it held something heavier." One by one, I slid the manifests into the hollow space. Each paper rustled like a whisper of armor sliding into place. Marianne closed the Bible. Its weight doubled, and set it on the shelf above her fireplace, hidden among hymnals and photo albums. "If Megan comes sniffing around," Marianne said, "she wants to find a damn thing." I exhaled for the first time all week. Later that night, I met with Thomas, my old military comrade turned lawyer. We sat in the back booth of a diner off I-10, neon lights flickering against rain-streaked windows. Thomas leaned over the stack of duplicates I'd brought. He slid his glasses down his nose, reading carefully. "Paper outweighs pride when it accepts proof," he muttered, tapping a page with his finger. "This isn't septa just documentation, Patrick. This is a shield. Hell, it seps a sword." I nodded, clutching my thermos of black coffee. "She sips mocking me to my face, Tom, and she sips plotting behind my back." I heard her say it herself, to trade him out before the payout. His eyes sharpened. "Then you record everything." Dawn said, "Confront her." Dawn said, "Tip your hand. Let her words bury her." That night, back in my truck, I bought a small recorder from a gas station off Highway 6. I slipped it into my coat pocket, tested the red button with my thumb. The click felt like a trigger. The next day, December 2nd, I stopped by my son's house under the guise of returning a borrowed ladder. Megan opened the door, all smiles, charm turned on like stage lights. "Patrick," she said sweetly, "you didn't have to bring it yourself." Her eyes flicked down to my uniform. "Still playing security guard?" I smiled thinly, the recorder humming in my pocket. "All part of the job," I said. As she turned, I caught her muttering under her breath, "Cheap uniform, cheap man." The words cut, but I didn't flinch. Instead, I pressed the recorder tighter against my side, ensuring every syllable etched itself into memory. That night, sitting alone by the depot gates, I replayed it through the tiny speaker. Her sneer filled the cab of my truck, sharp and cruel. I pressed my wife's Siptus wedding ring, warm against my chest, and whispered a vow into the empty air. They one det shame us. Not anymore, not for polyester, not for pride, not for gold. Over the next week, I gathered more recordings, casual digs at family dinners, phone calls overheard through cracked doors. One evening, December 7th, I even caught her bragging to a friend on speakerphone. "He sets guarding boxes like they set your treasure. The old fool doesn't set it, no, I set you'll get my hands on the payout one way or another." Click, saved. Every file, every sneer, I labeled by date and time. By the end of the week, I had a folder tucked away, each recording another nail in her coffin. On December 10th, back at Mary Ann's, I held the Bible in my hands again. Heavy, secure. The manifests lay hidden, the recordings backed up on a drive Thomas gave me. I pressed the pocket watch to my ear, its tick steady as a heartbeat. Dad, I whispered, staring at the Bible sep's cracked leather, you carried us through wars. Now I still carry us through this one. And in that moment, I knew the path had shifted. It wasn't just silence anymore, it was strategy. And every page, every tape, every sneer recorded was a step toward the day her mask would shatter in court. Greed always reveals itself when you put it close enough to temptation. It was December 15th, 2018, a Saturday afternoon when Houston's winter sky turned gray and the air carried the faint chill of rain. I called Megan that morning, keeping my tone calm, casual. You ever wonder what I do behind those gates? I asked her. She laughed, the sound dripping through the phone. What, polish keys? Hand out clipboards? No, I said slowly. If you want, I can show you a little tour. There was a pause. Then curiosity, or maybe hunger, crept into her voice. Really? I thought all that was top secret. Not if you stir with me, I lied. That afternoon she arrived in her red SUV, nails painted sharp crimson, designer coat cinched tight. Her heels clicked against the depot's concrete floor as we passed through security. The guards nodded at me, their eyes flicking curiously to her, but no one questioned. My badge opened every door. We walked past the first set of steel gates. The sound of heavy locks disengaging echoed like thunder in the cavernous hall. Megan smirked, tilting her head. All this fuss for boxes, she muttered under her breath. The cameras caught her clearly, her expression smug, her lips curling in disdain, while in the background stood row after row of pallets wrapped in steel casing. Inside those casings lay bars of gold, each one gleaming faintly beneath industrial lights. She paused, staring just long enough for her greed to betray her. I saw it in her eyes, the way they lingered on the sealed cages. Looks like a storage unit for bricks, she scoffed. But her voice faltered, betraying awe. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The depot's cameras were rolling, every angle capturing her sneer, her careless mockery, her proximity to the very gold she dismissed. By the time we left, her mask of charm had slipped slightly. In the SUV, she adjusted her lipstick in the mirror, her tone sharp. So? She asked. All this security, and you said her the guy with the keys? Among others, I replied. Her silence said more than her words. That evening I sat in my truck outside Marianne's house, watching as she watered her winter pansies under the porch light. I stepped out, the cold air biting my face, and joined her. She came, I said simply. Marianne arched an eyebrow, and the cameras caught everything. Every smirk, every word, its sips all archived. She exhaled, shaking her head. Patrick, she sits circling like a vulture. I nodded. Which is why I clipped her wings tonight. Earlier that day, while Megan was distracted at the depot, I had logged into the joint account my son had unwisely opened with her. Over the past months, she had been eyeing transfers, setting up little test withdrawals. Nothing large, but enough to show her hand. With Thomas's guidance, I filed the paperwork to freeze the account. It wasn't theft. It wasn't sabotage. It was protection, lawful, strategic, precise. By midnight, when she tried logging in, she would see nothing but a notice, account restricted, pending review. I pictured her face when she read it, and I allowed myself a thin smile. That night, sitting by Marianne Sipp's fire, I pulled out my recorder. Megan Sipp's voice from earlier echoed into the room. All this fuss for boxes? Marianne listened, lips pressed tight. You a stir stacking the deck, she said quietly. No, I corrected, pressing my father Sips's pocket watch into my palm, stacking the truth, piece by piece. The flames popped in the fireplace. I stared into them, seeing not just fire but foreshadow, the courtroom's fluorescent lights, the hush before a gavel, the moment her sneer would finally crack under the weight of proof. I touched my wife's ring through my shirt, the chain pressing against my skin. They mocked the uniform, I whispered. but it sets going to be the very thing that undoes them, because every key I hold, every camera I stand under, every manifest I sign, it sets all bigger than them, bigger than greed. Outside, the rain started again, pattering against the windows. I thought of Megan's eyes wide with both awe and envy as she stood feet from $200 million in gold. And I knew the deeper she stepped into the shadows of her own greed, the brighter the spotlight would burn when the truth finally reached the court. By Christmas Eve, the house smelled of cinnamon candles and pine needles, but beneath the glow of string lights, there was only tension. December 22nd had passed just 2 days earlier, the gold shipment complete, every manifest sealed, every pallet moved under my watch. The depot gates had closed on $200 million worth of federal cargo, and I'd stood in uniform as the trucks rolled out into the night. My job was done, my dignity intact. But Megan didn't know the truth, not yet. She thought she was clever, and I knew exactly how to let her prove it. On December 23rd, I planted a decoy in my study, a false manifest dated and stamped to look authentic but worthless. I tucked it inside a plain folder, just visible enough in my desk drawer that curiosity would draw her hand. That evening, as I sat by the fire at Marianne Sipp's, Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I nodded. She wouldn't be able to resist. He smirked. Then let her hang herself with the rope she pulls. On Christmas Eve, I stopped by my son's house with wrapped gifts. A sweater for him, a cookbook for Megan, though the gesture tasted hollow. The living room glowed with warm lights. Stockings hung perfectly, carols humming low from the radio. Meganetta Piltan's smile was sweet, practiced. Her voice dripping honey. Patrick, you shouldn't sit have. But her eyes betrayed her. They flicked, just once, toward the study where I'd left the drawer cracked open. I stayed long enough for eggnog. Long enough to see her mask slip when she thought I wasn't such watching. My son fiddled with the firewood, oblivious, while she excused herself to make a call. From the kitchen doorway, I caught the reflection in the hallway mirror. Megan slipping into the study, her fingers curling around the drawer handle. My pulse quickened, but I didn't move. I let her have her moment. Minutes later she returned, cheeks flushed, voice brighter than before. So, Patrick, when are you thinking of slowing down? I met her gaze evenly. Soon enough. That night, back in my truck, I opened my recorder and spoke softly into it. December 24th, 9:14 p.m. Megan took the decoy manifest. Thomas's words echoed in my memory. Paper outweighs pride when it's proof. On Christmas morning, I confirmed my suspicion. Her lawyer, a slick operator she thought I didn't know about, had already received the document. Marianne's friend at the courthouse tipped me off. Megan had hurried the papers straight into her counsel's hands, convinced she was holding the key to my retirement fortune. But the real manifest. It had been sealed under affidavit a week earlier, stamped by the courthouse clerk, locked tight in Thomas's file. By Christmas night, Megan's game had already collapsed. When she tried to press my son about rights to retirement transfers, her voice rose sharp, desperate. He shoved his plate away. Voice breaking, "You stir tearing us apart, Megan. Do you even hear yourself?" I stayed silent at the table, staring into my glass of water, but my pocket watch ticked in my hand beneath the tablecloth, steady as judgment. Hours later, when the shouting died down, I caught her in the hallway, whispering into her phone. "We got it. The manifest proves he's Seps holding more than he admits. We Seps will drain him before he even retires." Her words snapped through the recorder like brittle glass. I didn't confront her. Not yet. Evidence thrives in silence. On December 26th, while Megan nursed her wounded pride, Thomas filed the real manifest with the county court. The papers were sealed, notarized, and stamped into the record. By the time Megan realized her copy was worthless, the truth was already bulletproof. That evening I sat alone by Marianne's fireplace, logs crackling, the house filled with the smell of cloves. My sister handed me a cup of tea, her face lined with quiet pride. "She thinks she's outsmarted you," she said softly. "She thinks," I echoed, holding my wife's wedding ring against my chest. But in court, thinking isn't said enough. Proof is. I leaned back, staring into the fire, picturing the day to come, the courtroom filled with silence, the judge's gavel poised, Megan's mask slipping for the final time. Every sneer, every insult, every stolen scrap of paper was leading her there. And all I had to do was wait. Christmas Eve had cracked the surface, but Christmas night shattered the foundation. December 24th, 2018. The house was still glowing with fairy lights, carols buzzing faintly through the speakers, but beneath the cheer there was venom in the air. My son sat at the head of the table, jaw clenched, staring at his untouched dinner. Megan sat opposite him, fork stabbing at her food with sharp, deliberate jabs. I kept my eyes on the glass of water in front of me, my pocket watch heavy in my hand beneath the table. She had pushed too far. "You don't understand," Megan snapped suddenly, her voice slicing through the silence. "Your father is sitting on money and we have a right to it. Do you think I married into this family just to scrape by while he plays security guard?" My son Sep's face flushed, his fork clattering to the plate. "Megan, stop." "No," she shouted, leaning forward, her eyes glinting. "He hides behind that cheap uniform, but he's Sep's hoarding a retirement fortune. We should be planning our future, not waiting for him to die in polyester." The words hit harder than any slap. I felt the chain of my wife's ring burning against my chest, her memory anchoring me as rage threatened to boil over. My son stood abruptly, his chair scraping across the hardwood. "You stir tearing us apart. Every damn conversation is about money, about what you think he owes you. He doesn't owe you anything." Megan's lips curled, but before she could answer, I reached into my coat pocket and pressed the recorder's button. Her own voice filled the room, sharp, venomous, undeniable. "The old man sessions the guard. We'd sell, trade him out before the payout. Best of not waiting 30 years for scraps." The room fell silent, the recording crackling through the tense air. Megan froze, her face paling, her fork still hovering midair. My son turned slowly, eyes widening, betrayal flooding his features. He looked from her to me, his chest heaving. You said you were protecting us." Megan Sitt's mask cracked, but he didn't wait for her excuses. He grabbed his coat, stormed out the front door, and slammed it behind him. The echo rattled the ornaments on the tree. I sat there, the pocket watch ticking in my palm, its sound louder than her shallow breathing. She tried to speak, to spin, but I lifted my hand sharply. "Don't set," I said. My voice was steady, low. "Every word is already saved. Every lie is already sealed." I left her sitting at the table, her wine glass trembling in her grip. The next several days crawled by. December 25th came and went in silence. My son avoided me, avoiding her too, staying with a friend downtown. His calls were short, his words clipped. The wedge between us had grown wider than I'd feared, and Megan had driven it deep. December 26th, 27th, 28th. The days bled together. I buried myself in shifts at the depot, standing guard over empty cages and signed manifests, my thoughts circling endlessly. At night, I sat by Marianne's fire, the pocket watch ticking in my hand, each second a reminder of time slipping, of patience required. She would call me sometimes, her voice icy. "Patrick, you said you're making a mistake. This will all blow over." Other times, it was desperate. "Please don't drag this into court. Think of your son." But I didn't answer. Evidence thrives in silence. On December 29th, I met with Thomas again, this time in his office lined with military plaques and law books. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "She sips overplayed her hand," he said. "The recordings, the fake manifest, the depot footage, it's Sep's airtight, but the courtroom won't just be about evidence. It's Sep'll be about dignity. You need to walk in there calm, collected, not like a man chasing revenge, like a man protecting legacy." I nodded slowly, fingering the chain around my neck, the wedding ring pressed against my chest, the pocket watch ticking in my palm. "She mocked the uniform," I said quietly. "But the truth is stitched into every seam." I said, "Not fighting for polyester. I said, "I'm fighting for what it represents, for my wife, for my father, for the years I said carried weight." They said, "Never understand." Thomas smiled faintly, then let the clock keep ticking. January 3rd is coming fast. That night, I sat on Marianne's porch, the cold winter air biting at my skin. The neighborhood was quiet, Christmas lights blinking on rooftops, the faint sound of fireworks testing the air for New Year's. I opened the pocket watch, listening to its steady rhythm. Each tick was a countdown, not to vengeance but to justice, not to ruin but to truth. Alone in the dark, I whispered to the memory of my wife. They think I sit up just to guard, but guarding gold has always been heavier than carrying it. And when the gavel falls, it won't sit be me who crumbles. It sit'll be her. The night stretched long, but the watch kept ticking. And with every second January 3rd drew closer, the courtroom waiting like a stage where masks fall, where silence breaks, and where truth finally speaks louder than pride. January 3rd, 2019. The courthouse in downtown Houston loomed like a fortress of stone and glass, its steps slick with morning frost. I climbed them slowly, my uniform pressed, my badge polished until it caught the pale winter sun. People glanced at me as they passed, some with respect, some with indifference. To them I was just a guard in polyester. But today this uniform was my armor. Inside, the courtroom was already buzzing. Attorneys shuffling papers, families whispering in pews, the heavy scent of varnished wood and tension filling the air. At the front, the Texas state flag hung solemnly beside the judge's bench. Megan entered moments later, flanked by her attorney, a slick man with a silver tie and a grin too wide for the gravity of the day. She wore a navy dress, pearls gleaming against her collarbone, her hair styled with precision. She walked with the confidence of someone who thought charm could bend the truth. When her eyes met mine across the room, she smirked, as if this was her stage and the curtain had just risen. The bailiff called order, and the judge entered, an older man with sharp eyes and a voice that carried like a gavel before it ever struck wood. The proceedings began. Megan's lawyer rose first, papers in hand. His voice was smooth, rehearsed. Your Honor, my client has come to light with evidence that Mr. Patrick has been concealing financial documents tied to his retirement assets. She has reason to believe she is entitled to shared interests in those assets through her marriage to his son. The words echoed, bouncing off the high ceilings. The judge adjusted his glasses, turning toward me. Mr. Patrick, is this true? I stood slowly, my lawyer Thomas rising beside me. Thomas's voice cut through the room like a blade. With all due respect, Your Honor, what my colleague fails to mention is how his client came into possession of the so-called evidence. Evidence that, as we will show, is both fraudulent and illegally obtained. Murmurs rippled through the pews. Megan's confident posture stiffened, her knuckles whitening on the table. The judge motioned for Thomas to continue. He pressed a button on the small monitor at the front of the room. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy depot footage from December 15th. Megan, in her designer coat and crimson nails, stood smirking near pallets of sealed gold. Her voice was faint but clear. All this fuss for boxes? Gasps stirred the courtroom. This, Thomas said, his tone steady, is the woman claiming entitlement to federal security contracts she mocks and does not comprehend. She was escorted by my client, legally, and yet even then she ridiculed the very responsibility that keeps this state SIP's gold secure. Megan SIP's lawyer leapt up. Objection, irrelevant character evidence. The judge waved it down. Overruled. Proceed. Thomas nodded, then reached for another folder. Now let us turn to the so-called manifest she submitted. He held it up for the court to see. The forged stamp glared under the light. This document was found missing from Mr. Patrick Sepp's study on December 24th. We have corroboration that it was taken by none other than Mrs. Megan, and we have the real manifest, notarized and sealed a week earlier. He placed the authentic manifest on the table with a heavy slap. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Meganista's lawyer shifted uncomfortably, his smooth tone cracking as he objected again. Thomas cut him off. Your Honor, the theft of a falsified document and the submission of it as truth speaks not to entitlement but to fraud. And we sept are not done. He pressed another button. The speakers crackled. Megan's voice filled the room. The old man Sep's just a guard. We selt trade him out before the payout, as stum not waiting 30 years for scraps. The words froze the room. You could feel the air leave people's lungs. The recording ended in silence so heavy it felt like a weight pressing on every chest. Megan's face flushed crimson, her lips parting as if to deny it, but no words came. Her lawyer looked down, shuffling papers he could no longer defend. Then came the moment that broke the room. Thomas stepped aside, and I placed my hand on the table. Slowly, deliberately, I laid the authentic manifest before the judge. The paper was thick, official, stamped with state seals. It gleamed like proof incarnate. This, I said, my voice steady though my heart thundered, is the truth, guarded, protected, and now delivered to this court. Every insult, every mockery, every theft has led to this moment. I am not a man hiding fortune. I am a man protecting contracts. Contracts that are not hers to touch, not hers to twist. The judge leaned forward, his gavel raised slightly, the room holding its breath. And then the final moment unfolded. My son. He entered quietly from the back, his coat in hand, his face pale but resolved. He walked past the pews, past the whispers, past Megan's trembling form. He stopped at my side, his hand resting firmly on my shoulder. I'm with my father, he said, his voice breaking but loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. The words cut sharper than any ruling. Megan's shoulders slumped, her mask crumbling in real time. The judge brought the gavel down once, twice, the sound reverberating through the chamber like thunder. Fraud established. Claims denied. Further action to be scheduled regarding attempted misrepresentation to this court. Megan's scream tore through the silence, shrill and furious, echoing off the wood and stone. But no one moved. Her lawyer stared at the floor. My son stood firm beside me, and I, in my so-called cheap uniform, felt taller than I ever had in my life. The courtroom had echoed with lies before, but today it echoed with truth. The courthouse emptied slowly, but the echoes of the gavel still clung to the walls. Megan's scream replayed in my mind like a broken record. It wasn't victory I felt then, it was release, like a storm breaking after months of suffocating clouds. January 4th, 2019. The headlines came swiftly. Local outlets splashed her name across morning papers. Fraudulent document submission, exposed in court. Neighbors whispered on their porches, coworkers avoided her calls, and friends who once crowded her parties drifted away like smoke. I drove through my son's neighborhood that afternoon. The holiday decorations still hung limp in the cold, but Megan's house looked darker than the rest. Her SUV sat in the driveway, its tires coated in a film of winter dust, the windshield smeared where she had half-heartedly scraped away frost. Through the curtains I saw her silhouette moving frantically, pacing, phone pressed to her ear, but no one was answering anymore. The lawyer who once promised her entitlement had quietly stepped back, unwilling to touch the fire she'd lit. 2 days later, January 6th, my son filed for divorce. The papers were served with quiet efficiency. I was not there, but Marianne told me Megan crumpled when the envelope was handed to her, her hands shaking as she read. Her empire of pride, built on mockery and manipulation, had collapsed into ash. Meanwhile, I walked the streets in the very uniform she had ridiculed. The same polyester she had called cosplay now felt like steel across my shoulders. Neighbors nodded as I passed. A cashier at the corner store said softly, "Sir, I read about the case. Good for you." The respect wasn't about the gold or the contracts or the courtroom victory. It was about the quiet dignity of not bowing, not letting mockery define worth. One evening I stopped by the depot after hours. The vast halls echoed empty, the cages bare after the December shipment. I walked slowly down the rows, my boots clicking against the concrete. For the first time I let myself smile at the silence. I remembered her standing there weeks earlier, sneering, all this fuss for boxes. Now those boxes had become her undoing. The footage, the mockery, the theft, all woven together like strands of rope that had finally snapped around her wrists. At home I hung the uniform on its hook by the door. The badge caught the glow of the evening sun through the window, a glint of quiet triumph, It wasn't wealth that gleamed, it was survival. Marianne joined me on the porch that night, 2 mugs of coffee steaming in the cold. She sipped, then said quietly, "Funny, isn't it? She mocked the cloth, and now cloth is all she has left." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "She shall never escape it now," Marianne replied. "Every employer will see that fraud charge. Every friend will remember that courtroom. The uniform she sneered at has become her shadow, not yours." I looked out at the winter street, the bare branches scratching the sky. She was right. On January 10th, the court finalized the fraud ruling, stripping Megan of any financial claims against me or my contracts. By the time the ink dried, her world had shrunk to ashes. Friends blocked her number. Job interviews vanished the moment background checks surfaced. She had wanted gold. What she got was silence. I, on the other hand, walked taller. The man mocked at Thanksgiving now received nods of quiet respect. At the grocery store, an elderly veteran clasped my hand and said, "Polyester or not, you carried yourself like a soldier." That night, I stood in front of my mirror, holding my father's pocket watch in one hand, my wife's wedding ring in the other. The ticking was steady, the metal cool, the weight familiar. These were the real treasures, not the gold locked in federal vaults, but the legacies carried in silence. Megan's pride had turned to ash. Mine had turned to armor. January 15th, 2019. The cold still clung to Houston Seps mornings, frost edging the lawns and car windows. I sat on my porch with coffee steaming in my hands, the newspaper folded across my knee. The headline caught my eye again. "Local woman charged with fraud, courtroom evidence unravels scheme." Megan's name sat there in bold letters, her picture beneath, not the polished, pearl-wearing smile she'd worn into the courtroom, but a mugshot. Her hair disheveled, her eyes hollow. I traced the ink with my thumb, not out of satisfaction, but as a reminder. This wasn't just about her downfall. It was about the weight of truth finally outlasting the weight of lies. That afternoon I drove to the Veterans Hall on the east side, the same one where my father used to take me as a boy. The walls were lined with plaques and faded photographs, men and women in uniform staring out from decades past. I handed the clerk an envelope, a donation from the last deposit I'd received. "Are you sure, Mr. Patrick?" she asked gently, counting the bills. "Positive," I said. This money carried me. Now it should carry someone else. It wasn't the gold that mattered. It was the dignity of giving, the chance to make weight feel lighter. But the real test of weight came later that evening, when I heard a knock at Marianne's door. I opened it, and there stood my son. His coat was rumpled, his face drawn with sleepless nights, but his eyes held something I hadn't seen in months. "Dad," he said, voice low, "can we talk?" We sat at the kitchen table, the ticking of Marianne's clock filling the silence. He stared at his hands, twisting them together. "I should dest believed you," he whispered finally. "From the start. But she made it sound like you were hiding things, like you didn't dest trust me, and I wanted to believe her." I studied him, the boy who had once clung to my hand in grocery store aisles, now a man grappling with betrayal. "You were caught in the middle," I said softly. "That sep's not an easy place to stand." "But I hurt you," he said, his voice breaking. "I laughed when she mocked you. I let her change the locks. I didn't set defend you when I should have, and I can set take it back." I reached into my shirt and pulled out the chain, the wedding ring glinting faintly in the kitchen light. I set it on the table between us. "Your mother would said the same thing I thet him about too." I told him, "Respect isn't set inherited. It's set's earned, and tonight you started earning it back." Tears filled his eyes, and for the first time in months, he reached for me, not with hesitation, but with the grip of a son choosing blood over betrayal. The weight on my chest lifted, lighter than any gold I had ever guarded. In the days that followed, whispers of Megan's fraud spread wider. Employers withdrew offers. Friends stopped returning calls. The charm she had wielded like a weapon now lay broken at her feet. She moved out quietly, her belongings stuffed into boxes, her pride crumbling with each trip down the driveway. Meanwhile, I walked taller. The uniform hung by my door, not mocked but respected. Strangers nodded as I passed. At the diner near the depot, a man I barely knew clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Heard about what you did. Takes guts to stand quiet until the truth speaks loud." I smiled faintly, sipping my black coffee. The truth had spoken, louder than mockery, louder than greed. One night, as fireworks tested the skies in early February, I sat again with Marianne on the porch. She poured 2 mugs of tea and asked, "Do you feel lighter now?" I thought of the courtroom, the gavel, my son's hand on my shoulder. I thought of the pocket watch ticking steady in my palm, of the wedding ring glowing in the firelight. "Yes," I said simply, "lighter than gold." Because that was the lesson Megan had never understood. Gold has weight, pride has weight. But forgiveness carries no chains. And in the ashes of her schemes, I discovered something even heavier than revenge: peace. January 20th, 2019. Houston's winter lingered, sharp and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones even when the sun glowed pale overhead. I sat on my porch wrapped in my old wool coat, a mug of coffee warming my hands. The neighborhood was quiet. Children's bikes leaned against fences, holiday wreaths still hung. Though Christmas had passed, their ribbons faded and sagging. A lone dog barked in the distance, then silence reclaimed the street. I opened my father's pocket watch, the familiar tick steady in the cold air. Each second was a reminder that time doesn't wait for anyone, not for grief, not for betrayal, not for revenge. The wedding ring hung against my chest, warm beneath my shirt, the chain pressing into my skin. I touched it lightly, remembering my wife's laugh, her steady faith and dignity over pride. If she were here, she'd tell me not to gloat, not to let bitterness stain the peace we'd fought so hard for. The uniform hung just inside the doorway, neatly pressed, badge glinting faintly in the shaft of sunlight cutting through the glass. For years that cloth had been my burden, mocked, underestimated, reduced to polyester cosplay. Now it was something else entirely. Armor. It wasn't the weight of gold I carried anymore. It was the weight of proof, of truth spoken aloud when silence had run its course. I leaned back in the rocking chair, the wood creaking softly, and thought about the path behind me. Thanksgiving sneers, a changed lock, whispered phone calls through frosted windows, the Bible hollowed to hold manifests. The depot cameras rolling, the courtroom's heavy silence breaking under the echo of her scream. Every moment had led here to stillness on a winter porch, my heart lighter, my shoulders squared. Marianne joined me, her scarf pulled tight against the wind, 2 steaming cups in her hands. She set one beside me and lowered herself into the chair next to mine. For a while we said nothing, just sipped our tea, listening to the wind brush through bare branches. Finally she spoke. "Do you ever think about how close she came?" I nodded slowly. Closer than anyone should have. If I hadn't been careful, if I hadn't documented everything, she might said won. Marianne shook her head. "No, Patrick. She could never have won because she didn't understand what she was fighting. She thought it was about money, but you were fighting for legacy." I let her words settle. She was right. Megan saw numbers, contracts, payouts. I saw a pocket watch passed down from my father, a ring from my wife, years of dignity woven into a uniform. She had fought for greed. I had fought for memory. The difference was everything. Later that evening, my son arrived. He stood on the porch steps, his face tired but softer than before. He held no papers, no demands, only himself. "Dad," he said, voice low, "I just wanted to sit with you a while." I nodded, gesturing to the chair beside me. He lowered himself into it, his shoulders slumping with relief. For a long time we watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the winter sky in streaks of amber and violet. Finally he whispered, "I am sorry." "I know," I said quietly. "But it's not about sorry anymore. It's about what comes next." He looked at me then, eyes wet. "Then what does come next?" I held up the pocket watch. Its tick steady in the dimming light. "Time," I said. "Time to rebuild, time to forgive without forgetting. Time to understand that respect isn't owed, it's earned, every day." He nodded, and for the first time since the locks had changed, I saw in his eyes not confusion or hesitation, but resolve. The porch grew colder as night set in, but my heart felt warm because revenge was finished. Justice had spoken, and what remained wasn't bitterness, it was clarity. I looked at the uniform through the doorway one last time, the badge glowing faintly in the lampset's reflection, and I whispered the words I knew she would Seth wanted me to say. You didn't set lose me, you gave me away. The wind carried the words off the porch, across the quiet street, into the winter night. And with that, the story of polyester, gold, and pride ended not with fury, but with peace. By spring of 2019, Houston's chill had given way to warm winds and budding trees. Life was returning to the streets. Children playing basketball on cracked driveways, neighbors tending to gardens, the scent of barbecue drifting through Saturday afternoons. For me, life had steadied. My shifts grew shorter as retirement crept closer. The courtroom storm had passed. My son visited more often, sometimes with takeout, sometimes just with silence. The kind of silence that felt like comfort instead of distance. But for Megan, silence meant something else entirely. One morning in March, Marianne handed me a thin flyer she'd pulled from the grocery store bulletin board. Look familiar? She asked, her lips tight with irony. I glanced down and nearly laughed. A discount clothing store on the edge of town had listed new hires uniform folding specialist. And there she was, Megan, her photo tucked into a half-page ad about community reintegration. I didn't believe it at first, but curiosity got the better of me. That evening I drove past the strip mall, the sun dipping low against the flat concrete sprawl. Through the wide glass windows of the store, I saw her. No pearls, no designer coat, just a faded polo shirt, her hair tied back, her hands moving mechanically as she folded stacks of navy blue security uniforms onto shelves. The same kind of cloth she had once sneered at. Polyester. I sat in my truck longer than I should have, watching as she moved from shelf to shelf. Customers passed by without recognizing her. No one whispered her name anymore. No one laughed at her jokes or nodded at her charm. She was just another face behind a counter, folding the fabric she once mocked. The irony was too sharp to miss. Life stitches its own justice tighter than any courtroom ruling. I drove home without going inside. Some part of me felt satisfaction, but another part, the part holding my wife's ring and my father's watch, felt only quiet closure. Weeks passed. Megan's name surfaced here and there in hushed tones. Employers turned her away once they saw the record. Friends she had once flaunted on social media unfollowed, blocked, vanished. Meanwhile, the depot treated me like a veteran of a war only a few understood. Guards saluted, clerks nodded, neighbors shook my hand. The polyester uniform had turned from insult to emblem. One evening in April, I sat again on the porch, the pocket watch ticking steady in my palm. Marianne joined me, as she often did, setting down 2 mugs of tea. She's folding uniforms now, I said, quietly, almost to myself. Marianne raised her eyebrows, then gave a small, knowing smile. Life stitches its own ironies. I nodded. She wanted gold. She got cloth. And I think that sips justice enough. The porch creaked under the weight of our silence, but it was a silence I welcomed. As night fell, I hung my uniform by the door, the badge catching one last glint of sunlight. For decades it had carried ridicule, misunderstanding, and weight. Now it carried only pride. The aftermath wasn't about screams or gavel strikes anymore. It wasn't about proving worth. It was about letting silence do the rest. Because in the end, it wasn't gold that defined me. It wasn't polyester either. It was dignity, stitched in silence, carried in time and guarded like the rarest treasure of all.